Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I'm Elizabeth from Gibson's Bookstore, the events coordinator, and I am joined by Mike Pride. Mike is one of the institutions of Concord, and we are very pleased to have him back at Gibson's, even if we were doing it virtually. We have his new book with us, Storm Over Key West, The Civil War and the Call of Freedom, signed copies of which are available at Gibson's Bookstore, and we are open for in-store browsing, curbside pickup, and shipping. Mike, we are so pleased to welcome you back to Gibson's. Tell me a little bit about your book.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm so glad to be back at Gibson's. I wish it were in person. I wish I could see the audience. I wish I could hear your reactions. And, as long as you didn't throw any tomatoes at me, I'd much prefer that kind of a venue. So the book is Storm Over Key West, The Civil War and the Call of Freedom. The storm is the Civil War, and the Call of Freedom is the call that was heard by African-American enslaved people all along the Florida coast, where the ships of the blockade squadron that was stationed in Key West during the war flocked to the coast to get on the ships and escape to freedom. It's also the call of freedom on the island itself, where enslaved people had built the forts, and one fort in Key West, one fort in the Dry Tortugas called Fort Jefferson. Fort Taylor and Fort Jefferson are the two forts. And Key West people had bought these slaves specifically to lend them to rent them to the Union Army to build the forts. So the federal government had basically not only not interfered with slavery in Key West, it had enhanced the value of slaves and greatly increased the population, the enslaved population of Key West. I should have started by thanking Gibson's, because I've been there many, many times. I've been a shopper there for a long, long time. My wife and I have been in several times in recent days, and I would say that it's one of the safest places to go in and browse of any place that we've been in New Hampshire. Their social distancing is practiced. Everyone wears a mask, and they've made it possible to actually do one of my favorite things, which is just sort of scan the shelves. So I hope you'll support Gibson's or your local bookstore if you don't happen to be from Concord, and avoid Amazon.com. I'm going to start by introducing one of the characters in the book, whose name is John Brannan. He's a captain in the U.S. Army, and he's there to build the forts. And at one juncture, he has a very small engineering company on the island. And at one point in early 1861, when Key West has joined the movement in Florida to secede from the Union, and Florida has voted to secede, becoming the third state to secede. Obviously, Key West, with its interest in slavery, is very pro-slavery and very Southern in its thinking. But the U.S. Army does have a fort underway on Key West, another one underway in the Dry Tortugas, and the U.S., the federal government, does not want Key West to fall into Confederate hands during the war. And the first man that really steps forward to keep this from happening is Captain John Brannan. He and his men are really charged with seizing the fort and occupying it before the Confederates try to take it. Now, this is important because Key West is known as the Gibraltar of the United States, the American Gibraltar, it's called, because of the two forts. It can really keep watch on the Florida Strait between Florida and Cuba, and control the coast and make sure that things are not sent out of Florida, goods are not sent out, and goods are not sent in. And more important even is that it means that they can keep ships from going to New Orleans and up the Mississippi River to both deliver and bring goods out. So John Brannan, I'm going to start by reading a little bit from this point in the story right near the beginning where the Florida has just about seceded. It's right about the same time of the secession. And John Brannan is going to be called upon to occupy the fort and bring his men there and keep it out of Confederate hands. The threat of secession was of intense practical concern to Captain John Brannan, a 41-year-old West Pointer. His small artillery company, the only Army unit on Key West, quartered at the barracks near the North Beach. It would fall to these men to take and defend Fort Taylor if war broke out. Although Brannan was a committed soldier and Unionist, he was living in the shadow of a loss that local people spoke of in hushed tones. In 1850, he had married Eliza Crane, the only daughter of Colonel Ichabod Crane, whose name Washington Irving had borrowed for the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Like the fictional Ichabod Crane, Eliza Brannan had, or was believed to have, vanished in the woods on a dark night. The mystery began shortly after John and Eliza Brannan arrived in Key West in 1858. When a doctor advised Eliza to spend fever season in the north, she and the Brannans' 7-year-old daughter, Alida, moved in with Charlotte Crane, Eliza's recently widowed mother, on Staten Island. One day, the two women, dressed in morning black, kissed Alida goodbye and took the 8 o'clock steamboat to Manhattan. They parted on arrival, agreeing to meet that afternoon for the return trip. When Eliza missed the rendezvous and did not come home, her mother-in-law contacted the police. Witnesses reported seeing a woman of her description hire a coach on Staten Island that night, but the police could not find her. Captain Brannan took leave in Key West to come north and search himself. He and his party followed the coach's route and walked the woods, dragged the ponds, and dug up any spot that resembled a grave. They found nothing. Eventually, he filed for a decree that his wife had either been murdered or committed suicide in a paroxysm of insanity. The New York papers took pains to dispel rumors about the mystery. The Herald questioned the competence of the Manhattan police while describing Eliza Brannan as a most respectable lady. Then the Herald and the Daily Tribune both reported, Mrs. Brannan was a lady of fine education and demeanor, religious in feeling, fond of literature, of a domestic disposition, affectionate and devoted as daughter, mother, sister, and wife. Her relations with her family and society were such as to preclude the idea of her voluntarily separating herself from her husband, child, and kindred. Any suggestion that she was alive, the paper said, emanate from those who know nothing whatever about her. After 18 months, the story of Eliza Brannan as a tragic victim disappeared as suddenly as she had. Two women spotted her in Florence, Italy. Then the Tribune's Rome correspondent reported that she had married another man. The writer's description reflected her new status as a villain. She was now a short woman with an unusually low forehead, sallow-faced, leaden, fishy eyes, and warts on the left side of her nose, near her eyebrow, and behind an ear. It turned out she had met and married Powell Wyman. Like her other husband, he was a West Point-educated artillery officer. Wyman told Eliza's brother she had left Brannan because he abused her. Brannan's cuckoldry made the rounds in the small universe of the Army. Yet when the secession crisis gripped Key West, his men and townspeople alike would learn that whatever wounds his private life had inflicted, he knew how to lead in an emergency. He would stand at the head of a succession of junior officers whose initiatives secured the keys for the Union. So I started with that because I thought it was kind of a good story, but I also wanted to give you a sense of the way that I have always approached history and the way that I approached it in this book. And that is, I tell history from the bottom up. I find the people who lived it, and I make an effort to tell the story in their words and to take those stories and put them together and tell a larger story. So I think John Brannon was certainly in later in the book, you learn about how he actually did his work of securing Fort Taylor and making it safe from attack from both land and sea. I want to move on now to give you a sense of the situation created by the seizure of the forts by the Union Army and the fact that the Union was going to be seizing on and holding the southernmost point in the United States during the Civil War. So here you had a place where slavery was fairly well established, where the people were very much pro-secession and pro-Southern, and you had this army contingent, and you had in the wonderful harbor of Key West a blockade squadron that was working both coasts to keep ships from leaving the coast and arriving on the coast bringing goods. One of the things that happened fairly soon after the war began was that the Union Army began sending regiments of troops to Key West and Fort Jefferson. Fort Jefferson became a prison. It's one of the most amazing things that we did in doing the research for this book was actually to spend a lot of time in Key West. And we took a plane over to, what do you call it? One of those planes that lands on the water. We took it a seaplane over to Key West, landed by the fort and flew over it and flew around it and then toured it and got back on the plane and came back. It was just a gorgeous day. But the fort there was a prison. It was occupied by Union troops, including the 7th New Hampshire Volunteers. There were always at least 1,000 soldiers there, sometimes more. Key West itself constantly had regiments of troops who were coming there. At the beginning of the war in early 1862, they sent 4,000 men who were briefly stationed in those two places, and greatly, more troops than there were people who lived there actually. And then basically over time they spread out and went up the coast and did various things up there. But I wanted to tell you kind of how this story began too for me, because it'll get us into some discussion of the slavery issue in Key West. I had finished a book called Our War in 2012, and in that book I had told the story of New Hampshire in the Civil War through the experiences of 50 stories and the experiences of people in various realms. And one of those stories was about a colonel from a graduate of Dartmouth College who was the colonel of a black brigade during the last years of the war. And one of the stories I also found was that a fellow from Ware, New Hampshire, by the name of Stark Fellows, was the colonel of the 2nd U.S. colored troops who went to Key West. And so originally I thought, well, I left him out of the book because I already had a black colonel from New Hampshire leading troops. When I found that this other person, I thought, well, black regiments, other than the 54th Massachusetts, don't really have any regimental history. So I'll try to write a regimental history of the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops. And so when I started that, I figured out that their whole service was done in Key West. And so I started looking into the wider Key West story. Why might Key West be an interesting place to write about? So I do have the story. The book does have, I think, probably the most extensive history of the 2nd U.S. Colored as part of the story, but it's only part of the story. And one of the things that, since I was trying to write the history of the war in a Southern place, I was very conscious of the fact that this story had been written in the past, but it had been written by white people who pretty much left out the black story. So I saw as the biggest challenge of writing the book to find the black voices and to restore the story of the black people who experienced it to history. And the difficulty, the challenge of this was finding the black voices. I mean, for obvious reasons. I mean, many of the soldiers in the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops were former slaves. They had been denied an education, so they weren't allowed to read. They weren't allowed to learn to write and read. So it's a real challenge to find voices, black voices. And I was poking around on the web, and I found a story in a historical journal in which a soldier from the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops was quoted. And I checked the footnotes of the story, and I found that he was a soldier of the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops, and that his letter had appeared in a publication called the Anglo-African. I had no idea what the Anglo-African was. I did a little research. I figured out that it was an abolitionist newspaper published in New York. It was two brothers, a publisher and an editor. The editor had traveled throughout the South visiting black regiments. They had opened their pages to letters from black soldiers in the latter part of the war throughout, and they had basically been an abolitionist voice before the black regiments were formed. And I wondered where I could get this. And so I started looking around for archives where it might be available. And I wasn't able to find it. And so I decided that I would try to find the person that wrote the story. So I started to look for, her name was Deborah Jackson, and there are a lot of Deborah Jacksons. So I started looking around and checking out these various Deborah Jacksons. And finally, I hit upon the fact that there was a woman named Deborah Jackson working right down the hall from me at Columbia University, where I had gone for 3 years to run the Pulitzer Prizes. And her name was Deborah Jackson, and she was working in the journalism school. And I walked down and I introduced myself and I asked her if she was the Deborah Jackson who had written this story. And she said yes, and we had a nice conversation, and I told her what I intended to try to do. I could not actually spend a lot of time writing a book when I was running the Pulitzer Prizes, but I wanted to keep my hand in. So the next day, Deborah Jackson walked into my office, didn't call me or anything, she just walked in. She walked up and she handed me the microfilm rolls of the Anglo-African. Of course, I was excited about this, and I went over to the library during my lunch hours for several days in a row, and I read the Civil War years of this newspaper. And in it, I found a great many letters from not only Black soldiers in Key West, but also from Black civilians in Key West. And I already knew that one of the most remarkable characters that I've ever written about lived in Key West and was in fact the leader of the Black population, free and enslaved. And he had written or co-signed 2 or 3 letters that I found during the years that I was writing about. And so I was very, very excited to find these things. His name is, by the way, is Sandy Cornish, and he is somewhat revered in Key West now, maybe one of the only Black people from that period. If you go to a place called Mallory Square in Key West, there's a bunch of statues of the most famous people of Key West or the leaders of Key West over time. And most of them from that period, the Civil War period, were pro-slavery, racist politicians, some of them. I mean, you didn't even have to say they were racist politicians because all the politicians were racist, basically. But then there's this little bust of Sandy Cornish there. I also went to the cemetery in Key West, which is a very interesting place. The iguanas crawling over the graves and all that. So, and there, his body is not there, I don't think, but there's a plaque that they've put up on a pole that tells very briefly his story. So he's a fairly well-known person there. Sandy Cornish was a slave from Maryland. He was a large, burly man. By the Civil War period, he's in his 60s. When he was a slave, he was, after working in the house and in the fields in Maryland, his owner decided to rent him to a railroad, to a company that was building a railroad near Tallahassee in a place called Port Leone. So he went there, got his freedom, and then wound up coming to Key West. He earned his freedom. His wife helped him. His wife Lila helped him earn his freedom. And in Key West, he had an incredible green thumb, and he could grow anything. And if you know anything about Key West, there's no soil there. Even the sand on the island is not really sand. It's called marl. They're small pieces of coral that have washed up. And so Sandy Cornish knew how to grow things. He grew coffee. He grew, I can't even list all the things that he grew, but he grew all kinds of fruit and vegetables, and he became the most successful gardener in Key West, and the wealthiest, and continued to buy land as he did this. And at some point during the war, he offered any slave who wanted a place to live after he was freed to come and live on his land. But I want to now, I'm kind of near the end of the lecture part. I want to read another piece. I want to read another piece of about the time that near the end of the war, what happens is, or after the war, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase, goes to Key West as part of a fact-finding mission about conditions in the South. Lincoln has been assassinated. Andrew Johnson is now the president. And Chase is sent to, or decides, he wants to be president himself. He always wanted to be president himself, but he wants to see what the conditions are in the South along the coast. So he stops in Charleston, he stops several places, and he winds up in Key West. And he and Whitelaw Reid, who was a newspaper man from Cincinnati, go to Sandy's garden where you can buy lunch. And Sandy, they ask Sandy about, his story, where he came from. And Sandy tells them the story. And when he's finished, Whitelaw Reid, the newspaper man, is so fascinated with what he has heard that he asks Sandy Cornish if he can come tomorrow and interview him at length about his life. And Whitelaw Reid later writes a book called After the War, which I found. And in it, when he gets to the chapter, it's about this trip, basically, and it's about the conditions in the South right after the war. And what Reid does when he gets to the chapter about Sandy Cornish is, rather than write it himself, he uses the interview as a kind of oral history. So you have Sandy Cornish telling his own story. And a big part of that story is about how he got his freedom. And that's what I'd like to read to you right now. So I think I told you that he was a slave from Maryland, and his owner rented him to a company that was building a railroad near Tallahassee. And he brought his wife with him, whose name is Lila. And the owner made a deal with him that if he could earn, he was allowed to keep a portion of his earnings, but if he gave those to the owner when he had reached a total of $3,350, he would be a free man. That was a lot of money in those days. So here's the little take about how he got his freedom and what happened afterwards. In the fall of 1839, Sandy and Lila Cornish moved to Port Leone, a new settlement on the St. Marks River along the railroad line near Tallahassee. Lila went into service at $15 a month. It took years for the couple to earn Sandy's freedom. Now, they weren't just doing it on her $15. He was getting, I think he was being paid some portion of $400 a month that was being sent to the owner. Some portion went to him, which then he paid the owner. It took years for the couple to earn Sandy's freedom, and soon after they did, disaster struck. A fire ravaged Port Leone, burning the Cornish's house and Sandy's free papers. Later, a gang of thugs heard that Sandy had no papers and came for him, intending to sell him at the New Orleans slave market. Even after they clubbed his head, tied his hands, and shoved him toward jail to await the next day's train, he broke free. Back home, he barked instructions to Lila, who fetched his needle box and made sure it was well stocked with needles, thread, and bandages. She cried all night. The next morning, the Cornishes walked together to the Port Leone Square, where he bellowed for the people to gather round. After telling the crowd he wanted none of his limbs, he cut a tendon in his right ankle, sat in his wheelbarrow, and sewed and bandaged the wound. He stabbed his right hip and jiggled the knife till the leg hung from his side. Lila closed the wound. He struck his left hand with a hatchet, mangling fingers. He stuck his severed pinky in his mouth like a cigar and shouted that if this was not enough to convince people to leave him alone, he would cut open his belly and pull out his entrails rather than be taken to New Orleans. White people in the crowd retreated, frightened to come near him. the black people lifted him into the wheelbarrow and wheeled him with his utensils home. Sandy survived the self-mutilization and was soon on crutches. When he could walk without them, he and Lila left Port Leone and eventually found their way to Key West. I think that story is, I don't have to say much about it. It's just such an amazing, it's an amazing thing how far people were willing to go to be free. And that is really a big part of the story. Throughout this book, I think you'll find that the slaves in Key West are quite brave. The slaves at Fort Jefferson are quite brave. The slaves along the Florida coast, as soon as they see those blockading ships coming up the coast, they run to the coast to get on the ships. It was a great experience writing this story, and not just because they have good key lime pie at Key West. So I want to thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
So at this point, we will remind people that this book is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Signed copies are available, and yes, we do ship. We are also offering curbside pickup and in-store browsing. If you do have questions for Mike, please do put them into the chat sidebar. We will be asking them. So you are a New Hampshire man, or you have been for several years. Tell me how you stumbled upon this story and why it called to you to write it.
Well, I grew up in Florida. I think that's part of the reason that it appealed to me. I had never been to Key West before. I was brought up on the west coast of Florida. I was brought up in the Jim Crow era. I remember when I was 4 years old, maybe. I was in a Woolworth store in Clearwater, Florida, with my mother, and I climbed up to get a drink of water, and a black woman came up to me and shouted at me that was not my drinking fountain. And I started to cry, and my mother talked to me and told me that, explained to me what exactly had just happened. And she was an incredible person, and just said, we were from the North, we were from Connecticut, we had moved there, and we had to accept the way things were where we now live, our new home. And from then on, I was always interested in the racial issue growing up. I happened to be in Florida during the civil rights movement, and so that I think was the big interest. I also think that just that initial event of finding that African American newspaper and finding all those letters that no other historian, as far as I know, had ever used. That's one of the great joys of history for me, is finding stories that other people haven't told. It's maybe go back to my journalism experience, where you're always looking for a scoop, and I feel like I have some scoops in this book.
You mentioned that you write from the bottom up. Whose diary was your favorite, or what tidbit that you learned was your favorite or surprised you the most?
Well, there's lots of tidbits, and I probably can't think of a favorite one, but I have no problem telling you about my favorite diary. I told you during my talk that the colonel of the Black Regiment was a Dartmouth graduate. He happened to be from Ware, New Hampshire, which is maybe 6 or 7 miles from where I live. And it also happens that there was a woman who lived there by the name of Emily Gove. And she wound up marrying a naturalist named Joseph Holder from Massachusetts. And they went to Fort Jefferson before the war, actually, and they stayed there throughout the war. She kept a diary. She and her husband used slaves that belonged to others to do work for them. She wrote extensively about her experience there throughout the war. And at the end of the war, at Fort Jefferson, 4 of the Lincoln conspirators were imprisoned. including Dr. Samuel Mudd, who he was fixed John Wilkes Booth's leg after Booth, when Booth was trying to escape. And he was guilty as hell. And a lot of people think he wasn't, but he was guilty. But he was an incredible complainer. And she knew him, and her husband knew him. And because there were 2 yellow fever epidemics in Key West during the war that killed hundreds and hundreds of men. It's a big part of my story in the book. But there was also a yellow fever outbreak while Mudd was there, and he had tried to escape and had been put in the dungeon there, but they let him out to help during the yellow fever epidemic because the main surgeon there died of yellow fever. So this redeemed him to some extent, but Mudd was suddenly the darling of all these southern-leaning Northerners who began to write to Andrew Johnson saying, "Free this man. He's been wrongly, blah, 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 blah. He's innocent in all this." But if you read his letters and you read about his life, you find out he wasn't innocent. And Andrew Johnson pardons him. So in 1869, I believe. So a life sentence becomes a 4-year sentence.
So you mentioned when I had asked you about the New Hampshire connection, and you mentioned that one of the first regiments to arrive in the Keys in 1861 was the 7th New Hampshire Volunteers, which was 1,000 men. So can you tell me a bit about their time in the fort, but also what did they bring home? Not physically, but did they bring home any changed mindsets?
Well, they pretty quickly grew to hate it there. It was a prison, and it was hot. They went there in the springtime, and it was just very, very warm. And they actually camped right in Emily Holder's front yard, and she actually allowed them to use her kitchen some of the time. And to use her, or the slave that she rented as well. I tell their story through a couple of people. I mean, one of the things that happens to every regiment that goes there is people get sick. If it's not a yellow fever epidemic, it's some other disease that really lays them low. And yellow fever did not come to Fort Jefferson until after the war. But when the 7th New Hampshire arrived there, smallpox had broken out on the ship south, and they had several deaths on the way. I tell mostly through the story of that regiment through a man from Enfield, New Hampshire, named Calvin Shedd. And Calvin Shedd was a farmer and had a big family, and he's a very, very colorful writer. And when they arrived at Fort Jefferson, one of the men in his company had just died of smallpox, and they had given him his little funeral right there while they were parked. They had dumped him off the ship basically into the water. And Shedd's looking over the edge of the ship, and he said, "I see a shark down there." He knew this was coming. So it was their experience was one of being very, very happy to leave, just like most of the people. So I think that's one of the reasons. There was one other regiment that stayed in Key West for a long time, the Pennsylvania regiment. But I think that's one reason that the Black Regiment wound up spending so much time there, was that it was duty that no one else wanted.
So you've written several books. Do you want to give us the elevator pitches on those books?
The elevator pitches? I've never heard that phrase before. What exactly does that mean?
The description that you can give in the length of time the elevator ride goes.
Right. So,
yeah,
okay.
Very
all right.
brief.
Got that. But what floor?
Yeah, right. We'll start in the lobby, go all the way up to executives. What can you tell us about your other books?
I wrote a book called My Brave Boys about the 5th New Hampshire with Mark Travis, who is on the line tonight. It was my first book, his first book, and it's a history of the 5th New Hampshire Volunteers under Colonel Edward Cross, a very colorful leader. I worked with Felice Bellman, who is now an editor at the New York Times, was at that time an editor at the Monitor, and we wrote a book of 100, we edited a book of 100 stories of people, of New Hampshire people who had been famous in the 20th century, trying to cover touch all the bases in that book. I wrote a book about a Bataan Death March survivor who had tried for 60 years to write his own book, and he had 800 pages of manuscript. And he sent it to me, and I turned it into a book of about 200 pages. And he and I went all over the place talking about it. And it was one of the great thrills of my life. I rewrote, that book is called Too Dead to Die. And I wrote a book about, I updated a history of Abraham Lincoln's speeches in New Hampshire, called Abraham Lincoln in New Hampshire. And then I wrote Our War, which is a story of what we talked about earlier, about 50 stories that tell the New Hampshire story. So that's basically it until this one. And now I'm writing a wartime biography of Harriet P. Dame, who is is a nurse from Concord, New Hampshire, who went to war with the 2nd New Hampshire at the very beginning of the war, and remained in the field and in various medical capacities until months after the war ended. So longer than any soldier served, Harriet Dame served.
And which war?
The Civil War, I'm sorry.
Civil War, okay. Is she perhaps from the family that the Dame School in Concord, New Hampshire is named after?
It's named after her.
Aha, see, there we are. Connections. So I think that's about it for us tonight. This book, Storm Over Key West, is available from Gibson's Bookstore. I do hope that we have you for your next book. We will hopefully be back in store for that. But if you do want a copy of this book, they are available from Gibson's. We do ship, we do offer curbside and in-store purchasing. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this evening. To everybody here at home, have a great night.
Thank you very much.